Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next in the series of Big Issues in Biodiversity Science webinars hosted by the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. We'll have some people still trickling in. I see the numbers are continuing to increase on my list of attendees, but I will kick off now this session where we're looking at the economic costs of biological invasion in Australia and around the world. I'm Owen Nevin, I'm the CEO of WABSI, and I'll be facilitating and hosting today. As we move through the session, I will facilitate the Q&A a little later, but it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on. Although we are meeting virtually, we are all in a place, and here where I am in the city of Perth, we're on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I acknowledge and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I think for those of us working in the environmental sciences and in conservation and land management, that acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land and the traditional custodians of this land holds special resonance given the long history and deep knowledge of land management and custodianship that our traditional peoples in Australia hold, the oldest continuing culture anywhere on this planet. So very appropriate to acknowledge them at this event today. The West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute is a partnership of 4 universities in Western Australia with 4 government departments, CSIRO, which is the Commonwealth Research Organisation, and the West Australian Museum. We operate to bring together research expertise to answer the questions of end users, bringing people around those wicked and complex problems in the environmental space and biodiversity science, where there are many possible levers and ways to address them, many possible outcomes, and a wide range of stakeholders. So we bring together the research, the end users, the policymakers, and industry community to try and generate better outcomes for biodiversity in this amazing state. We follow an end-user-led approach, and today we will be launching the most recent outcome of this flow from end-user through research expertise, through stakeholder confirmation of knowledge gaps, to a prioritization plan. And Bruce Weber, one of our research directors, will speak a little later about the launch of our weeds program, which has followed this pattern. And some of you will be familiar with our previous research programs and the work that WABSI produces, ranging across subterranean fauna, digital data, and things like feral cats. Today we're very privileged to be joined by Franck Courchamp, who is joining us from just outside Paris in France, to talk about the work of InvaCost and their global project valuing the impact of invasive species around the world. Franck is an internationally known and respected researcher who's worked around the globe and will bring much of that experience to us today in his presentation. And without too much further ado, I will hand it over to Franck to present. We'll take questions and discussion at the end, but do feel free to put your questions as we go into the Q&A box, and you can vote questions up and down to prioritize those as we get through the presentation. So Franck, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to share my screen for you. Okay. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about a peculiar aspect of biological invasions, the economic cost. It is something that I've obviously not done alone. There's a lot of people who have worked on that, and I've seen in the audience that there is at least one that I know. Hi, Ben. So yeah, I'm going to talk about biological invasions. I'm going to call the species that are responsible for them invasive alien species. I know that there's a lot of different definitions, terminology that is sometimes a bit overlapping, a bit blurry. So bear in mind that what I mean here is alien species that establish, spread, and become impactful. Unless I say otherwise. So we know that not all exotic species become invasive. So I will talk about exotic species for species that come from another part of the world. Introduced species could be present on a territory but not pose a threat, so they would not be invasive. And in Australia, you talk about weeds and pests as well. So when usually I don't talk about weeds, not for that anyway. So I will try to focus on invasive species. So not all species that are alien are invasive. We have what we call the 10% rule, even though it's not really 10%, but this rule says that a small fraction, let's say 10% of all the species that are introduced become established, and a small fraction of those become invasive. So in the end, it's 1%, not 10% as I've written in the bottom, but 1%. And 1% does not seem to be quite a lot, but if you introduce a lot of species, if you introduce thousands of species, then 1% can become a lot. And as a result, there are many invasive species and there are many alien species around the world. Here you have an example for Europe. In 2012, there were 14 alien species, perhaps about 5,000 that were invasive. So there are tens of thousands of such species in the world. They come from everywhere and they go everywhere. We share a lot with Australia, and well, actually, Australia hasn't provided so many. But they are really a problem for biodiversity and ecosystem services. They are a major cause of recent extinctions. You can see on this graph that in different parts of the world, and here you have Australia and New Zealand first, there are a number of species of different taxonomic groups that have been extinct as a result of biological invasions. They are currently also a major threat on biodiversity. Some say second, some say different, but they are among the 5 major threats currently on biodiversity. And they also have impact on human societies. They have sanitary costs because you have allergies, bites, stings. You have insect vector-borne lethal diseases, for example, via mosquitoes. And as a result, you have tens of thousands of deaths and millions of medical care worldwide every year. And then you have economic costs. Economic costs can be agricultural losses. They can be forestry losses. They can be real estate or infrastructure losses. They can be tourism losses, etc. There are economic costs as well. So why I'm telling you that, because you all know about invasion biology. I wanted to go to this point of this paradox of biological invasion. Perhaps it is a bit different in Australia. In this part of the world, people know a bit more about invasive species. Still, the public and the decision makers are not really aware and reacting and acting at the level, at the scale of the importance of biological invasions. They create huge ecological problems. They create huge sanitary, social, and economic problems. And yet they are quite little known as a major problem in most of the world, a bit more in Australia and New Zealand, and still not known enough as the catastrophe they are on ecosystems, biodiversity, and human societies. And so that led me to wonder why are political decision makers and the general public willing to protect biodiversity, but don't know or don't care enough about biological invasions to really act upon them. So I've thought quite a lot about that. So we have put together the results of those thoughts in a paper that was focused on the fact that there are very specific issues of biological invasions that are different from climate change or habitat destruction or pollution or overexploitation. And that makes them more difficult for people to understand, for scientists to alert, for collectivities or government to support, and the public as well, and also to implement. I'm not going to focus on all these because there are many, but I wanted just to focus on one, the difficulty to measure and to demonstrate the impact of the countless phases of invasive alien species. And in fact, one way to quantify impact, but also to touch non-scientists, is to use a metrics that they are familiar with, and that is currency. If we use currency, not only are we going to touch people who are perhaps less interested in the survival of a species that is across the globe and that they will not ever see anyway. Perhaps they will be more interested if we talk about the millions that we are spending. But also having a single metrics is very convenient to be able to compare things and to compile things, a bit like climate change has the Celsius degree or deforestation has the hectare. So we wanted to work with dollars, for example. And there are studies on the economic cost of biological invasions. There are lots of them worldwide. When I started, I thought, okay, we're going to deal with a handful of dozens of studies, but in fact, well, little did I know, there are many, many more, and they are actually increasing. But they are very different. They are very different. You can have, for example, in yellow here, the damages by 2 species of mussels in Canadian lakes from 91 to 97. You can have something that is yearly, for example, the 1,000 annual hospitalizations due to the red imported fire ant in the USA. You can have a study that is focusing on the control only of one species for a continent in a given period, including a future period with extrapolation in the future with the data from the past and the present. You can have a study that is going to mix 2 different activity sectors, for example, the yield losses in agriculture and the health costs due to ambrosia in a few countries in Europe from 2012 to 2017. And then you can have also the management cost of all the invasive mammals in a given year in Japan. Or you can have the potential cost of the brown tree snake if it were to invade Australia. So it's a potential cost. It's not an observed cost. And then you can have, for example, the waterway blocked by floating primrose willow in only a given number of countries for a period of time, and the money that is cost. So you have different temporal and spatial scales. You have different location. You have so different currencies. You have different cost types, the damage or the yield or the losses versus the management investment. And you can have costs that are actually occurring and observed, and you have costs that are potential because they are extrapolated in time or in space. So with all these studies, it's not really possible to easily compile the studies or even to compare them, and it's not even easy to make a synthesis out of that. There are some more global studies. Mainly, they are restricted to either a particular taxa, particular area, particular sector. For example, Paini in 2016 on agriculture. You have a study on insects. You have a study on insects in forests in the USA. Generally, you don't have a large, a global synthesis because it is not standardized, so it's difficult to compare and to compile. We therefore have a need for reliable synthesis at the global scale. And that is what we have done and what I'm going to present you. The InvaCost project, the first global compilation of published economic costs of biological invasions. And I insist on the published in the wide sense. It means that we are working on studies that are existing already. We are not doing new studies. So what we have done is that we have reviewed the literature for studies with explicit estimations of costs of biological invasions. We have compiled, standardized, described, and analyzed them. And the idea was to develop a defensible, systematic, transparent, and repeatable work strategy for data collection so that new data could be also added. So we have three key aspects. Everything is freely accessible from the resources to the outcome. Our aim is to be useful for research and for management. And also, our database is not only collaborative, as I'm going to show you, but also updatable. So we collect data in 3 steps. The first one is to have a specific strings, search string on Google Scholar and Web of Science, and also to request data from experts directly, contacting them. So we can have both the peer-reviewed and the gray literature, like reports from governments, etc. This is the search stream. We did that in 15 different languages. And when we started that, I thought it would be a good idea to get something like perhaps 25% more, 20% more of our database. In fact, doing that allowed us to double the database. So non-English data was really, really important here. Then all the materials we had was screened according to relevance, and then it was collated and standardized. All the data was collated from each of the material. Every cost data was then converted into a single currency. We chose the USA dollar of 2017 because that was the year where we first stopped the database. We have extended it since, but at the time, 2017, so we had to take into account inflation rate and etc. And for each single cost entry, we had about a bit more than 60 different descriptors that were divided in 4 different categories. First, those related to the reference itself, then to the invasive species itself, to the study, the spatial coverage, the time range, the impacted area, etc. And then to the typology of the cost, the impacted sector, the method assessment, the nature of the cost, etc. And I'm not going to tell you everything about this classification, but I'm going to tell you just 2 aspects because they are important for the results. The first one is the typology of the cost. I've looked quite a lot for how to divide the cost in different types, and I thought I would find it into environmental economics, but there is no such thing. So what I did was to simply divide the type of the cost into 4 different categories: ecology, ecosystem processes, human health, and goods and services. And then into a further 3 parts, which are prevention, damage, and response. And if you do that, then you have 12 categories. You have the 4x3, and in fact, that is all. Everything can fit into this 4x3 categorization. So I'm putting everything here, not for you to read. It's not really readable anyway, but just to show you that everything can fit into this classification. But what is interesting here is that you have a gradient from ecology, the green part, to goods and services, the yellow part, which is both a gradient of direct utility to human and monetizable costs. So this means that the upper half is going to be much more easy to monetize. And therefore, we are going to have much fewer cost studies on the lower end of on the lower part of this typology diagram, which does not mean that the costs do not exist. It just means that we won't be able to collect them and to put them in our database and therefore in our results. Now, the second thing that I wanted to show you about the typology of the cost and the classification that we have done is the reliability of the cost. We have divided all our costs into high reliability or low reliability according to the information that was given in the study about the methodology, whether it was repeatable or not, and the sources, whether it was traceable or not. And then we have also a division of our costs according to whether they are observed or potential. So the implementation is very simple. If the cost is occurring currently, then it's observed. And if it is projected by, for example, modeling or simple statistical extrapolation in time or in space, then it is potential. And what we have done simply is that in most of our studies, we have focused on what we call the most robust data, which is the intersection between the high reliability and the observed. We have only taken this part of our big data set. So the results, we have now over 13,000 cost entries and over 60 descriptors. So it is much bigger than what I anticipated when I started this study in 2014. So with this big database, we published first the database itself in Scientific Data, which is a journal for databases, to explain how it works and what is inside it, because it's quite a big one. And then we were drowning in data. We had much more than we were able to analyze and to handle. But there was such a wealth of data that it was really a pity to just do one big study and let the rest rest. So what I did is I organized a workshop in France in November 2019, just before the pandemic would have prevented us to do so. And the idea was to share the database. So I put the database online for the world to use it if they wanted to. And in the meantime, I launched a project to analyze the database. So I did some advertising and I selected among the over 150 applicants some experts. I focused on early career researchers. I focused also on having a balance both in gender and in geographic representativity. We had 27 countries, 5 continents, and in the end there were 47 of us of several disciplinary fields. There were ecologists, economists, managers, theoreticians, people working on aquatic environment, terrestrial environment, plants, animals, etc. And we started thinking about what we could do as studies. So we had a number of studies that were quite descriptive, where we focused on costs from major taxa. So for example, what are the economic costs of invasive fish worldwide? What are the economic costs of invasive bivalves or crustaceans or ants worldwide? And we had 11 studies detailing the costs from major taxa. We also focused on description of costs from major regions. And here we had 23 different studies. What are the economic costs of invasive species in South and Central America, or in Brazil, or in Ecuador. And we also had conceptual studies. So the conceptual studies were more focused, they were less descriptive, and they were more focused on understanding, describing, predicting, and also extrapolating the costs of biological invasions. And on that, we launched 27 different studies. So this has been a long-term, massive collaborative effort, as you can see. In total, 71 studies. The group has grown since the initial 47 that you see here. We now are 103 from 39 countries. It has well progressed because we have now 27 papers that are accepted and another 17 that are currently submitted. When I say accepted, accepted or published. The idea was that because they were mostly early career researchers, the idea was that each of them, often a postdoc or a newly recruited researcher, would take in charge one of these studies as a lead author, and everybody would be able to collaborate on as many papers as they could manage. So it was really a collaborative effort because many people had been working on many papers, but they all had one paper at least as a first author. And the idea was a win-win situation because we had too much data. We had a strong knowledge of the data and the database. We didn't have the time to exploit everything. And the early career scientists often had the skills, the know-how, the motivation, the time, but not the knowledge of the database, and also not often the funding. So we also funded not only the workshop, the travel, accommodation, everything, but also the open access of the papers once they are finished. So the results. The costs are massive. That is the main result. Since the publication of the first paper, the database has been updated 4 times, and now we are at a minimum of $1,899 billion. So, or 1.9 trillion, and a trillion is a million. So that is an enormous cost. That is an enormous cost in less than half a century. Just for 2017, we have a cost of over 160 billion US dollars. So when I said dollar, I mean US dollars and US equivalent of 2017 dollars. And to give you an idea of what cost that represents, this single value of 2017 is more than the GDP of 50 out of the 54 countries in Africa. Only four countries have more than that. And it is also over 20 times higher than the total funds available for both the World Health Organization and the United Nations that year. The two budget combined that year, over 20 times higher. So a cost that is enormous. The second interesting point that we put forward with these studies is that the costs are unevenly distributed. They are very dependent on the taxonomy group, for example, and even in the kingdom, you can see that there are many differences between plants and animals and microorganisms. What is important for me to highlight here, to remind you, is that those are only the studies that exist, that there are reported costs. So it doesn't mean that, for example, microorganisms are not very costly. It mostly means that we don't have a lot of data on microbes and fungi. They are also unevenly distributed according to the regions. You can see here the cumulative costs per country. And you can see that we have a lot of costs for the United States and for Australia, for example, which is going to translate into very high costs. It doesn't mean that the costs are not higher in other regions, for example, in Africa. Simply, we don't have many studies from this continent. And it doesn't mean that the cost in Australia is artificial. It is a real cost, but it is a minimum estimate. And also the costs are unevenly distributed according to many different other categories. For example, the impacted activity sector. If you look here at the different activity sectors that we have globally in the world, on the overall data set. You can see first that you have a large part that is gray, which is all the studies that didn't really say which impacted activity sector they were working on, or that mixed several together. And second, you can see that agriculture is the most often impacted activity sector. Another interesting result is that the costs have been increasing. They have been increasing quite a lot. If you look at this very nice linear increase, you can see that it is not linear at all because the costs are in fact in a log scale. So it is an exponential increase. You have a few points here that are quite low. It's just because there is a lag between the time of a cost and its report in the literature. So we are still expecting the last 3 years data to be complete to be able to really compare them. But you can see that it's really increasing quite a lot. And in fact, it is doubling every 6 years. Another interesting point is that management is much less costly than damage and losses. So perhaps I should not phrase it this way. The management are costly, but the losses are even more important. And these again are reported costs. And you can see that it is not evenly distributed according to the region of the world. You can have parts, for example, in Africa, where there are more reported management costs and other parts where it's much less. And to show you another example of the uneven distribution of the cost, you remember that I mentioned implementation, whether it's observed or potential, and reliability, whether it's high and low. Those are the two columns here. And you can see with the example of Africa and the different regions in Africa that the proportion of implementation, both of the accumulated cost or the number of costs that we have, are very different. And it's also the same for the method reliability. So this is kind of a complex and heavy figure, but the objective here is just to show you that there is a lot of different things according to the different variables that you take, and it's quite difficult to just give a global answer. If you remember the impact activity sector that I showed you earlier for the world, which is the first line here, if you look like for the previous slide on different parts of the world, you can see again that you have an uneven distribution, but also a different distribution according to the region of the world. Now you could also focus with this data on what invasive species is causing those costs, and you have something that is even more messy and even less clear. But let's take a quick look still. What you have here is in columns the region, and in lines the taxonomic groups, and in between it is the impacted sector. So the first thing that you are going to look at is the size of the it's the size of the circle, whether it's a big cost or a small cost. Then it's the color, again with yellow as agriculture, pink authorities, stakeholders, which is generally the government or the NGOs or the industries, and then it is either empty or full, the circle. And when the circle is full, it means that, for example, in here, North America, insects, we have the most impacted factor is agriculture. But if you look at mammals, then it's empty, and it's empty because it is the second most impacted factor. The first one was mixed sectors, everything put together. So the idea of this graph again is to show you can have two levels of information here. The first one is that it's messy. It's that it depends. There's a lot of information. You cannot say that, for example, agriculture is always the most costly impacted, the most impacted sector. And then you can have a second level of information where you look more precisely at some different costs if you want to have them. But the message here is that it was difficult for us to publish one big study with the global cost. If we wanted to provide information that was a bit more interesting locally or for some taxonomy groups, it would have been much bigger than a thesis. And that is why we did so many studies that, as I showed you previously. So what about Australia? I said that we had 23 different countries or regions, and we had a study about Australia. So that's a study that has been published in Neobiota. It's a special issue with 19 such papers focused on different regions of the world. It's led by an Australian with different Australian people and also quite a few others, people who are from the core group of the InvaCost consortium. So you can have all the information in this paper, which is open access, as all our papers are. One thing that I wanted to insist on was that in this paper we have an abstract in 20 different languages, including all your favorite ones, meaning that there is French as well. So what are the costs there? The costs since 1960 are, at least in US dollars, 300 billion, which is quite a lot again. You can see on this graph here that most of it is high reliability and observed and not potential, and that most of it also is damage or loss compared to the management, about 1/4 management. It's again different according to the taxonomic group. You can see here different kingdoms, and you can see that the plants are the highest here. It's again a log scale, so the difference is quite important. Of the plants, the identified woody grass species are the ryegrass, parthenium, and ragwort. If you look at the classes instead of the kingdoms, then the 4 cost lists are the mammals, the insects, Eudicotyledon and Monocotyledon. And if you look at the species themselves, then it's the cats, the rabbits, and the red imported fire ants that are the costliest in Australia, as the costs are reported in the literature. If you look at the states or the territories, they have a different suite of major costs by invasive species. You can have even more information here if you look, if you go look at the paper. I'm not going to expand too much on it because, as you can see, it's very state dependent. So, are these estimates accurate? No, they are not. They are overestimations and they are underestimations. For the overestimations, we have some dubious accounts. There were studies that were quite low in their reliability. And also we had some multiple accounts. The multiple accounts are duplicates when, for example, you look at, let's say, the forest pests in the USA, and you have another study looking at the invasive insects in North America. You are bound to have some species that you are counting twice. And so we have been working on that, trying to remove all the duplicates. It's really very, very time-consuming procedure, but we are now confident that we have removed all, if not all, but most of them. And then under underestimations, we have many values that are missing, and also we have taken a conservative approach in our study. And I'm going to focus on that now, but this means that the costs are massively underestimated. I told you they were massive, approaching 2,000 billion US dollars. But they are not only massive, they are massively underestimated. And we are here seeing only the tip of the iceberg. And this is because of 5 different sources of underestimation. The first one is that, as I've told you, I have taken only the most robust costs. I have taken only the highly reliable observed costs. And if we take into account also the less reliable costs and the extrapolated costs, which are costs, even though we thought they were less robust, they do exist, then you would multiply by 4 the amount that you have. By the way, here it's a bit lower. It's because that was our first estimate in the Nature paper with the first version of the database. Now we are at version 4. Another source of underestimation is the missing cost. The taxonomic gaps, for example, globally, we have less than 10% of invasive species for which we have economic costs studies. We have also geographic gaps, as I showed. Some regions are much less studied, and it doesn't mean that the costs are not as important in those regions. Then you have inaccessible costs. For example, the documentation was not accessible. We have used 15 different languages, but perhaps it's not enough. There is, as I said already, a confusion within invasive terminology. And it means that with our search strings, we have missed a lot. For example, I don't recall having searched specifically for weeds, because weeds in most parts of the world are just native species that are problematic, for example, for agriculture. But in Australia, it has a wider meaning, and it includes invasive alien species. So we are missing a lot of them. One simple example is the rats. The rats are native to only a few regions of the world. They are invasive in most of the regions of the world, but they are considered more as pests. And often, if you have costs, for example, on agriculture, on grain reserves, on infrastructures, or on health, for example, because they are disease carriers, often we could not find this information because they are not labeled as invasive species. And then you have costs that are not monetized. We know how to monetize them, but they have not been monetized because it's time consuming and there's just not enough researchers in the world. For example, if you focus on health, people who get, if you have an epidemic, for example, let's say of Zika or chikungunya, then you have revenue losses for all the people who are going to get sick and who don't go to work. You also have the salaries of health and research staff. And then you have also education losses, which we know how to estimate, because the kids and the students have not been able to go to school or to university, and they have missed educational opportunities. And this is going to impact the economy of the country in the near future. Those are non-monetized costs. And then you have non-monetizable costs, the costs that we just don't know how to monetize. There are non-market costs. For example, what is the value of a species that is impacted by an invasion and that gets extinct? What is the value of an ecosystem disturbed by an invasion? And all those are costs that exist, but that are not monetized, not monetizable, not accessed, etc. And that makes our massive estimate also a massive underestimate. And remember, the costs have been increasing. I told you about thrice every decade. And we know also that there is no saturation of the invasive species themselves. They are also increasing. So as global trade is increasing, they bring more species. As climate change is increasing, they allow more establishment of species. Then we are likely to have more frequent and more widespread invasions, and therefore the costs are going to be important. In addition, you have an invasion depth. We know that there is a lag between an introduction and the impact. We have a report lag that I've mentioned, a lag between the cost and its report in the literature. And because of the 3 points that I've just mentioned, then we can expect our costs to increase much further than they are already increasing. This is just to show you that everything that I've mentioned, all the resources, all the outcomes are available freely on invacos.fr. In the resources, you will find not only the database, but the FAQ document, the frequently asked question, a starting package with an R package that will allow you to analyze all your data sets, the sub data set that you want to select. So you should be able to do your own analysis from the database and publish your own papers from the database with all the resources that we've made. And on the outcome, we have put all the papers online. They are all open access. So the conclusion of this, the economic costs of biological invasions are massive. They are massively underestimated. They are very diverse and heterogeneous, and they are likely to keep increasing. Also, we need more and better studies to estimate them, because as I've said several times, we are only relying on what exists so far, and only a tiny portion of the costs do exist in the literature. We need more studies on more invasive species, on more regions, on more types of costs. There are a lot of impacted sectors that have very little data. And also we need them more standardized with fewer mixed species or mixed impact sectors, etc. So this means that for those who are not aware of biological invasions or of their importance, this demonstrate that at least for the economic part, they are really problematic and they should be prevented and managed and studied. And in all of our studies, we have one focusing on, we actually have two focusing on biosecurity management and the cost of inaction, the economic cost of delaying the control of an invasive species as it spreads and as it gets more costly to control or eradicate. But the overall conclusion here is it's not all about money. Money here was an excuse. It was a way to raise awareness, but the major problem of biological invasions is biodiversity loss. And a lot of the impacts that are done by invasive alien species are not monetizable. And it is important to remember that the focus of most people working on biological invasions is the protection of biodiversity. And on this, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to questions which I think are going to arrive in a while. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Very informative presentation, and questions are actively flowing in through the Q&A button. We will shift gear for a moment to zoom right down in from that global perspective to Western Australia and from the breadth of invasives, both animal and plant and microbial, to our recent work around plants, invasions, and the weeds program that WABSI has been working on. And if you bear with me a second, I'll just move from Frank to that. We'll return to Frank for questions combined with some questions for Bruce Weber around this program. But it's opportune to launch our weeds research program in this webinar, where we are taking this global focus on the costs of invasive species and invasion. And unfortunately, our Environment Minister, Bridget Sanderson, could not be with us today, but did highlight the importance of this work and congratulate the team on producing it. We do have a few words from West Australia's Chief Scientist, Professor Peter Klinken, in regard to launching this piece of work. So I shall bring that up for you. And hand over to Peter's recorded message.
Kai nunakot, Nature Wajak Nunga Buja, Don't Kadich Nunga Bernie Mam and Birdie Yoga, Kura Kura, Wayay. Hello, everybody. This is the land of the Noongar people, particularly the Wajak clan, and I acknowledge their elders, past and present. Non-native invasive plants, or weeds, as we commonly refer to them as, are currently amongst the greatest threats to native biological diversity. And there are significant costs to agriculture, costing Australia between $3 and $5 billion annually. Western Australia has a variety of ecosystems. Our southwest is a global biodiversity hotspot, but is also under considerable threat from weeds, and this is compounding the effects of habitat loss. We need a better understanding of all measures of weed impacts so that we can more proactively control weeds. A deeper understanding of weed ecology and its impacts through research will enable us to target how we deliver weed control methods much better. To address this knowledge gap, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, WABSI, has brought together community groups, scientists, government and industry to establish what we currently know about weed control and where we need greater knowledge. This stakeholder consultation guided the development of WABSI's research program called Addressing Weeds Threats to Biodiversity. I'm delighted to launch this really important initiative. When funded, this research will dramatically improve our efficiency in weed control programs, and it will reduce the threat to native biodiversity and lead to enhanced conservation outcomes. I wish you well in your deliberations. Bordawan Nunuk Jinang, I'll see you later.
Thank you, Peter, for those words of introduction. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bruce Weber, Program Director for Threatening Processes in Ecosystems here at WABSI, who has led the development of our weeds program, to say a few words about the process and key findings. So over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Owen. And thanks, Frank, for a great startup talk. I'm just going to share my screen here. Trust we have that. So look, I'd like to start by thanking a lot of you who are on the call today. This has been a long process pulling this weeds program together, and I can recognize a lot of names on the call today who have made significant and incredibly valuable contributions to this program. So I do hope as we work through this very high level overview, you can see your fingerprint of influence on the program that's going to follow. As Owen said, we have a traditional pathway that we follow for developing programs at WABSI. It's a prioritization process. It's an end user-led prioritization process. And to develop something like that over the last 12 months, where the global pandemic has been influencing how we engage with people, we prefer to engage face-to-face. We prefer to have those more effective face-to-face discussions, but that wasn't possible in this current program. So we took advantage. There's pros and cons to face-to-face versus virtual engagement. And we took advantage of those presented to us for virtual engagement and used that approach, not too dissimilar to this, across the course of that program. It starts off with end user engagement. We turn to end users to tell us what keeps them up at night. What are the big challenges that they are facing? And as Owen pointed out earlier on, if there is a research element to this, then WABSI is interested in finding out what that is. We identified over 400 stakeholders and across 50 or more institutions who have an interest in getting better management outcomes for weeds in the state, and many of those people were engaged in this process. We had over 150 attendees at our 3 sets of workshops through the course of this program, and many more people who fed us additional information through phone meetings or emails around that. We're a very big state. We're one of the biggest states globally, bigger than many countries in the world, and we encompass a huge range of ecosystems. And so we thought it would be appropriate to split up consultation processes according to geographic region. There are different issues at stake in different parts of Western Australia. And so you can see the map in the bottom left-hand corner. This is how we split up that initial end user engagement process. These 3 pie charts show the breakdown of the end stakeholders we engaged with across the development program. As we're an end user-led organisation, you can see the end users dominated that engagement process. But if you break it down by region or if you break it down by organisation, you can see we spanned a great deal of the organisations who have a vested interest in improving outcomes for managing weeds. This is what we found. Across the course of these workshops, we identified 120 issues that are keeping people up at night that they need a solution for, they need a better solution for. Through the course of these workshops, we distilled these down through discussion and debate and compromise and agreement. And we boiled that down into 28 research topics and used this framework that was also brought about during the course of these workshops to hang these research topics off in terms of broad groups. 4 strategic themes. That is improving the value proposition, which I think Franck has talked wonderfully about, one way to articulate the value proposition of managing weeds. Second is the toolkit. How do we better improve our management of weeds? Third is the biology, and by better understanding the biology, we are then better able to improve our tools, better able to articulate our value proposition as well. And finally, once we all know that, then it's about how do we get more effective delivery of that insight into transforming on-ground outcomes. That we broke down further into 8 focal areas. And if I want to give you a brief insight, just a very high-level insight into some of those 28 topics that came up. Now, just out of interest, it is worth pointing out that there were a range of issues that kept people up at night that didn't have a research element to those. Though those were recorded, but they were not pursued as part of this program. We are about identifying knowledge gaps that can be solved through research. So if it was a policy or collaboration or a communication issue that didn't involve research, those were set aside. But if we unpack issues relating to the value proposition, you can see defining success. A lot of the weed management programs that we implement, we actually don't know what we're trying to achieve with that program. It's not clearly articulated from the get-go. Communicating and clarifying outcomes. In terms of social license, community perceptions floated to the top. Biocontrol, and certainly in Northern Australia, achieving effective weed control at a vast scale, some of the biggest scales in the world. We are in charge of managing weeds over. That came under the group of control. From a detection process, there was a lot of new technology that featured in detection to improve detection at an earlier point to be able to tackle weed mitigation impacts earlier on in the invasion curve where the return on investment is greater. Understanding the impact of weeds is a really important process now. So many more of our prioritization processes are moving towards prioritizing based on impact rather than just presence or abundance in the landscape. This is a good move, but if we are going to do this better, we need to truly understand and quantify all of those impacts. And it's not just monetary impacts, it's social impacts, it's cultural impacts. And as we all know, the most challenging one in that space is to clarify and quantify environmental impacts. And really, in terms of when we're rolling out processes, it's about making sure those lists of weeds that apply in each area are clearly articulated and evidence-based. We didn't take it down to species level in this program, but we made sure that if you were to apply the priorities identified in this program to your given region or area, that you would be able to work through that process and say, okay, this is most likely the species that would pop out as the focal study system where we would implement this high priority research knowledge gap. So all out of that came this program. We're going to be releasing the program today. There will be a web link made available so you can all download the PDF. The first component of that is to understand the value proposition of managing weeds. It is an incredibly complex challenge to help people who control the purse strings, people who make policy, end users who are engaged on the ground. Many of them do understand why we do need to do better against controlling weed impacts, but we needed to make sure that value proposition was crystal clear. This is a great tool for you to have in your elevator pitch if you are pitching to someone who needs to understand why weeds should be controlled. We've talked about the research plan. The research plan expands on those 28 research project areas, as we talked about on the previous slide. But we don't want this program to sit on a shelf and gather dust. We want it to be implemented. We want new findings, and we want to be able to roll those findings out so they're in the hands of end users and actually achieving impact on the ground. So we've also included an implementation plan in there. How do we achieve funding strategy for this, the quantum of funding needed, and where we go to and for how long, and all those things are articulated there. A governance process is really important as to ensure that this rolls out effectively, and mitigating risk in terms of rolling out the program was also articulated there. So we are going to roll this out in the next little while. There's going to be a steering committee formed. Many of our research programs previously released have had a form of steering committee overseeing them to facilitate translating this into actual on-ground outcomes. It's a matter of finding the research expertise, it's a matter of finding the funding, it's a matter of finding the on-ground collaborators right from the get-go, so we are able to translate these new insights into a real difference, and to really make sure that end users are able to adopt those findings. I'm going to leave it at that. I really want to get into the Q&A session of this, so I appreciate you listening, and if you'd like more details, please don't hesitate to download the PDF and look at that for all of the gory details. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. And as Bruce said, we'll make the PDF version of the program report available on our website at the conclusion of this webinar, so you don't jump off and download it. Start reading now while we're still taking questions. And the questions are flowing in. What I'll try and do is summarize a few themes that are appearing in the questions, and you can, as well as putting questions in, vote questions up the list, and I see them moving on the screen as you vote questions up in terms of priority. I'll start with a question directly to Franck relating to the increasing trend in cost that was found across the InvaCost study, so that exponential increase in cost. And the question relates to whether is that a real increase in cost, or is that a perceived increase in cost because of an increase in reporting occurring over that 30-year, 40-year time period of data collection?
That's a very good question. Actually, it's a bit of both. There is an increase in awareness and therefore in the studies and therefore in the number of costs that we find. And there is an increase in both the damages that are done, the number of species that do this damage that are superposed. And in fact, you can very easily compare the trend of the number of studies, the number of entries that you find, and the cost itself. And you can see that the costs are increasing much faster than the number of studies. So it is a bit of both, but the trend, the increase is real.
Thanks. And while we're on that topic of cost, a number of people have flagged the recent publications that have suggested that the input cost estimates are an underestimate. And I know you addressed this in the presentation, but just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how that conservative approach has derived that lower estimate than a country by country and additive on that basis approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this reply to our Nature paper is in fact not suggesting, because it is true, they are correct. It is highlighting that although all the species and all the taxonomic group are underestimated, the plants are more underestimated than the others. So yes, it is true. Actually, it is even said explicitly in the Nature paper. At the time, at the first version, we had fewer studies on costs of plants than on other species. So now the question by Jacques Leroux says that there are costs associated with countries such as South Africa with estimates that are higher than the overall global estimate. So the thing here is those costs are in our studies. All the costs that have been mentioned in this letter, in this reply, are in our database, but they are either extrapolated or low reliability, and therefore we did not take them into account. We have similar costs for animals that have not been taken into account. If we were to take everything into account, not only the highly reliable and observed, I told you that in 2017 we would have 4 times higher cost. But in fact, if we were to take them for the whole period, we would have more than 20 times the cost. So as the database is updatable and as the costs are flowing in and the costs are changing, what we have done is that we have created a living figure, which is going to be associated with the Nature paper. So Nature has said yes already. It's going to be a correction of the Nature paper where the figure with the geographic costs and the taxonomic costs are going to be directly fed by the database. So each time we change the version, the figure is going to change. And I'm going very quickly to show you that. If you allow, it's going to take half a second. If you go into InvaCost, you can go into the outcomes. And in the outcomes, you can see here this living figure. And if you click on it, then you will have both the taxonomic group on which you can zoom. You can have all the information here. And you can zoom on it and look at the costs of one particular group, or you can also do that with the countries. So you have exactly the number, the cost in one region of the world as it is currently in our database. So yes, the plants have been underestimated more than the rest, and we are trying to correct that by this living figure.
Fantastic initiative to have that ongoing updating to the peer-reviewed outcome of the study. So an exciting combination of live feed data with the published outputs. We've also had a number of questions around any insight you have in those non-monetized costs? So there was one question that was asking around when you looked at the initial figure and you said the top half of these impacts are things that we can monetize and the bottom half are not. Do you have a feel for the quantum of studies that sit on either side of that divide? So, you know, was it a 50-50 split, or is that something that you don't have an answer to?
No, this is really important. We have very few studies about that, simply because it's difficult to monetize, but also because people care less. People who work with economic costs are going to be less focused on, I don't know, like the loss of species or the loss of biodiversity than the loss of agricultural yield. So this is something that we have to handle with care, because we are focusing on something that is very human-centered, anthropocentered, but our ultimate goal is to raise awareness on biodiversity. So we try to end most of our papers, because we might have missed some, but we try to end our papers with a conclusion saying that, remember that this is just a part of the impact, and it is not the most important one, as I did in my conclusion here. So yes, we have a lot of possible costs there, but we don't have them in our database, most of them.
Bruce, would you like to comment a little on how that split between the monetized and non-monetized is handled in the WEEDS program, and where the focus is with regard to primary production versus biodiverse habitat?
Thanks, Owen. Look, there's a couple of points, good points to mention in regard to that one. I think we focused nicely. The InvaCost results came out at an ideal time for us to incorporate into the WEEDS program, but we fully recognise that there's many ways to break down impact, negative impact of WEEDS. One way is in the triple bottom line approach, where you are considering environmental, economic and social cultural impacts, and really you can monetize the economic side of things, but as Franck says, monetizing the other two is incredibly difficult. And I think we must see this as a way to draw attention to understanding the impact of WEEDS, but we can't overlook the intrinsic value that biodiversity has, and therefore the need to invest and mitigate the threat of weeds to our biodiversity. There is a really good point was brought up in the questions there. There are new emerging ways for valuing the impact of the value of our biodiversity, and therefore the impact of weeds on that. Natural capital accounting methods are opening new avenues to explore in that regard, and I think we are getting better at articulating the value proposition for why we should act against weeds, and that's really the case that we put in the program. This approach that Franck has taken is just one of many reasons to act.
Thank you. A really sort of practical question for you, Franck, that's come through from a few of our PhD students in the audience. What are the opportunities for PhD students to get engaged in this exciting database and the work that you're doing?
So I just replied on the question about the PhD, which was not a question, rather a comment that there should be a good group to include. Actually, we have included PhDs. We had at the workshop, I don't know, like half a dozen. Now we have way more than that, but it is true that there are fewer than postdocs, because simply often PhD students have their own project and they have a limited time to do it. So they cannot really divert their resources to another project. Now for new PhDs to chip in, we already have had several who have contacted me. They are all welcome to dig in the database and do the studies they want. They can, of course, contact us if they want a hand. It's not compulsory. We don't want to have a grab on everything that comes out of the database. That's not the point. But we can help in some cases. Now, the thing is, we are quite underwater with the number of requests and studies, and we cannot work on everything. So there is a large chance that we will not be able to get involved personally, but of course we can give advice, and everything is open access.
Excellent. Thanks. Another question that sort of comes from a different angle. Are there any examples in your database of financial benefit seen from invasive species? So
yeah,
and if so, how was that then treated in your analysis?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, when we started the database, we did not systematically collect the benefits when they were present, but we marked the fact that there was some benefit. So at the moment we cannot, so we have all the benefits that we have found, but we have found them in the studies that we were searching for costs. So there are possibly some others that we have missed because we have not focused our research on that. So we have not studied them quantitatively, but we have a paper that is in revision at the moment on what we call ambivalent species, the species that both are costly and also have an economic benefit. Then you also have species that are that have an ecological impact, but also that are economically beneficial. For example, I don't know, fish, angling fish, the tourism and sport industry of fish. It is a tremendously high lucrative industry, but also it costs a lot and it impacts a lot. So we have a study on that, but we have not been able to quantitatively compare the two. For the data that we have, we know that it's like at least one order of magnitude lower the benefits than the cost, and possibly 2 orders of magnitude. So it cannot be an argument. And also I've seen in the question a question about the new ecosystems and the local increase of biodiversity. So I think here the keyword is local. Usually when you introduce species in an ecosystem, you may increase locally the biodiversity if you don't have too many species that disappear, which is not always the case. But globally, you don't increase biodiversity and often you decrease it. So that is really something that is not taken into account for people who advocate these new ecosystems. It is important to keep in mind that biodiversity is the global loser of biological invasions.
Bruce, do you care to add anything around the consideration of some of the conflict species here in WA, where some groups may see an economic benefit while others may see a cost?
Thanks, Owen. Look, conflict species or species that are valued in different ways by different stakeholder groups were a common occurrence in the workshops we worked through. The most common one we have here in Western Australia is buffel grass. It's been mentioned on the chat. I think even down to underlying naming, we have a weed, Patterson's curse, that is also known as Salvation Jane. So you can see these competing interests for values create challenges for working out what is the most appropriate management response. I think if we are able to get down to quantifying impacts rather than just working off opinion, we will be in a better position to make better decisions around this. And I think we, as a society, we're getting better in appreciating the value of native species for doing things that maybe the default in the past has been in just to bring in a species that we know works somewhere else in the world. Can we achieve that same outcome from an economic or an agricultural perspective, say, with a native species instead that doesn't require or doesn't risk having all the off-target impacts of that intended benefit? There's a lot of scope for improving our decision-making and potentially our weed mitigation management through that.
And while you're speaking, Bruce, perhaps there's a question there on whether the weeds report and prioritization crosses over into freshwater aquatic systems, or if it was purely terrestrial in focus.
Yeah, look, freshwater terrestrial aquatic systems are an incredibly important part. There are countless threatening examples of weeds in Western Australia that have either wreaked considerable damage or required considerable investment of resources to get under control, and some of those are not under control. If you expand that to riparian environments, the list gets even higher, particularly as you move into the northwest of the state. We didn't get down to breaking down impacts and costs to that level of granularity in the report, but aquatic ecosystems and riparian ecosystems are given as examples of high quality habitat that may have overrepresented impacts in terms of if we're looking to prioritise where to invest our weed management dollar. They are mentioned in the report as an example of where we need to focus.
Thanks. And Frank, back to you with a question around the impact of this study on policy and policymakers. And are you seeing policy-focused papers coming out among those sort of 71 papers looking at you drawing on the data in the database? Do you have any feel for what proportion of those focus on a policy agenda?
So so far we don't have one on policy because we don't have expertise on that. We have one on the legal frameworks, and it's one comparing the strength of the legal framework of countries and the costs, and whether there is a link, and whether the countries that are more equipped in terms of laws focused on invasions are also having fewer costs or higher costs. This paper is it's not submitted yet. It is in the final steps of preparation, and we don't have anything focused really on policies, just because we don't have the expertise.
Thank you. I'll just run my eye over the list of questions again. If either of you have questions that you've spotted that you'd like to address that I haven't brought up, I'll maybe open the floor to either Frank or Bruce to comment.
I've tried to answer a few of them by typing, but I may have missed some of them. Yeah. Because I read them all, and they are quite interesting. So I hope we have answered most of them.
Yeah, I think we've covered off on most things, and hopefully we haven't missed your question if you put one in there. But I think in answering the questions, we've covered on a number of occasions, touched on a few questions. Bruce, are you want to?
Yeah,
comment?
look, Owen, I think there's a few questions in there that I could probably address in a single answer if it wasn't clear from my earlier talk. And there's questions about addressing certain weed species in certain parts of Western Australia, and was that a priority for the weeds program? And we deliberately avoided going down to target mentioning specific species for this program. We wanted to make it applicable to the entire state. And what we're hoping is that certain practitioners in certain areas will be able to use the program as it stands to work through what are the priorities that pop out, and then translate that into what is the priority for that issue in their part of the state. So, I mean, a good example of that is that if you look at control, one of the highest priority issues identified for improving control for more research is biological control. So I think one of the questions there talks about the biological control of veldtgrass, and if you were able to put together an understanding of whether that is feasible for that region and where the impacts of veldtgrass are quantifiable and significant in that region, then you could probably put those two bits of information together and come up with a justification for why that may float to the top of the priority list. Hoping to make the program as useful as possible to as many practitioners across the state. I think the other point is this is hopefully the findings that we develop here in Western Australia are going to be broadly applicable nationally, but we know a lot of the weeds here in Western Australia and Australia are weeds and problem invasive alien species elsewhere in the world. So hopefully this knowledge can be translated to improving outcomes globally.
Yeah, thank you. And that's certainly been the case with the feral cats research priorities program has been useful in prioritizing as a starting point for some other jurisdictions. So that ability to stay at a higher level and not make a region-specific, species-specific list is of value. We have had a few questions, both in the chat and in the question box, about when the documents will be available. If you visit the WABSI website, you will be able to download the newly released WEEDS program right at the conclusion of this session. And please do browse our other work which is there while you visit. The recording of this session will be made available. It takes a couple of days to top and tail the process and make it available for download. So you'll get an email as a participant with a link to be able to view again at your leisure and look at those presentations in more detail. I'd like to once again thank Franck for making the time to speak with us today and sharing a very interesting and insightful presentation. And I hope that many of those that are participating will take the time to drill into that InvaCost database, which has such a wealth of information within it. Thank you, Bruce, for speaking around the WEEDS program, and the next in the series of big issues in biodiversity science webinars will actually be the first of 2022. So this is the last of 2021. I think that this is the first occasion where I've said the last something of the year. This is the last big issues in biodiversity science webinar of 2021. We will return with a series of quarterly webinars in 2022. And if you've registered, we will have you on our mailing list to send out an invite and information for that. So thank you everyone very much. And with that, I will close today's event.
Thank you for your invitation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.